You went to trial.
Yes.
You were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. She was given 3 years probation in order to attend a 52-week domestic violence program.
The jurors just didn't want to let Bryn off because she had stabbed Chad so many times.
It's my opinion that the jury just couldn't wrap their head around the science.
You got what most people would say a very lenient sentence from the judge.
I was expecting to go to prison.
What do you say to people that say she got away with murder? Our two-part exclusive interview with Bryn Spejcher continues. Last night, I began my conversation with Bryn Spejcher, a doctor of audiology who was found guilty in the death of Chad O'Melia after falling into a cannabis-induced psychosis and stabbing him 108 times and then turning the knife on herself. It took 7 police officers tasing Bryn 4 times, hitting her with a metal baton 9 times, and finally breaking her right arm to get the knife from her hand. Here is what happened last night. Let's talk about the night of the incident.
I decided to stop by Chad's condo, and typically he likes to smoke marijuana. I did ask him, can I have a hit?
And you told him that you didn't have much of a reaction to the hit that you took?
And he was very shocked. He followed up with, oh, well, let's make this really intense for you.
Did he go get something?
He grabbed more of something in his drug kit, and the only difference I noticed was that there was much more smoke in there. It looked a little more milky.
When you did it, you had a completely different reaction.
Everything was so much more intense and stronger.
And what did you do at that point?
I stumbled out of the chair, and I could start to see the entire room start to spin clockwise. That was the last conscious memory I had.
What was the next thing in your vision?
Then this next phase was the traumatic phase. And I describe this phase like a camera is sitting right here, and there was movement occurring in the living room, and there were chairs flown, and the movement kept going towards the kitchen. And I saw the 2 hands grab the knives and turn towards Chad and throw the knives towards Chad. And it grabbed another 2 knives, and then there's a brown dog in front of me, and the knife in the left hand stabbed that dog. And I heard Chad say, oh my gosh, why did you stab my dog? And then the movement kept moving towards Chad. And as I got closer to him, I saw the knife in my left hand stab his abdomen. And then it just went black. And then the next thing I remember is his body was on the floor, and the screen turned back, and I saw the knives in the hands continue to hurt Chad. And then that's when I would start to hear voices.
And they would say what?
Keep going, don't stop, you're almost there. And then the next vision I remember is seeing one knife in both of my hands, aimed towards the center of my throat. And that's when I was trying to hurt myself. Trying to aim the knife again towards my throat felt like 1,000 bullets a second.
How many times did you stab yourself?
Felt like thousands.
When you were stabbing Chad, how many times did you stab him?
108 stab wounds.
Have they told you how they got the knife from you?
There was police force with the baton.
It broke bones?
They definitely used it on my neck, shoulder area, my hands and arms. So there was a broken bone and the ring finger bone.
We have a picture of you in the hospital. I'm curious how you react to the fact that you had this in you to do what you did.
I can't. I mean, it's just clearly I was in a psychosis. I never knew what cannabis psychosis was and that was even a thing.
I've done entire broadcasts trying to warn the country that this ain't your grandma's marijuana. You know, we were at 3-4% potency in the 60s and 70s, and now can be 35-40%, and some products can be 95%.
It's so scary.
And people don't realize, particularly with a naive user that hasn't stair-stepped up to this, it can lead to psychotic episodes, can trigger schizophrenia, can cause problems with heart attack, stroke. I mean, there's a number of things that can happen, and we're speeding along towards legalizing this as though it's just, you know, hey, why not? And I'm throwing the flag on this time and time again.
I mean, and again, this happened in 2018, and I think that was the year California made marijuana legal recreationally. And so back then, I mean, it was like, oh, states are now legalizing it. It's fine, it's healthy. And, you know, that's just the general knowledge that we knew then. And it's obviously shown that's not really the case.
You went to trial.
Yes.
And you were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter.
Correct.
And you could have gotten 4 or 5 years for that. You know, there are a lot of people that are outraged that you got what most people would say a very lenient sentence from the judge. Do you think it was lenient?
Absolutely.
Were you expecting a more severe sentence?
I was expecting to go to prison.
Yeah, and I'm not asking for a legal opinion. I'm just asking just in your sense of right, wrong, justice.
After the verdict was read, I was trying to prepare and study for prison because there was 2 months in between the verdict and the sentencing, and I was just in a black hole trying to prepare myself for prison and watching shows and researching on it, on how to prepare for prison, because I really thought I was going to prison.
And you did spend some days in jail, right?
I did spend 6 days in jail, yes.
And again, I'm not asking for a legal opinion at all, but what do you say to people that say she got away with murder?
Someone's life was taken with my hands. It's something that I would have never done. I would never hurt anybody. And it's just very hard to believe that this is something that actually happened. It's just been so long. It's been so long. I still can picture so many things from that horrific night. I still can see it like it was yesterday. And I don't think it'll ever go away.
What do you say to people that say, you know, she got away with murder?
That they don't know the facts of the case, and they weren't there at trial to really know everything that happened.
And, you know, so I've told you, I've done multiple broadcasts on the dangers of marijuana-induced psychosis. And I've dealt with people that are in agitated psychotic states where it's taken 6 or 8 orderlies to control a 110-pound, 70-year-old man in an agitated psychotic state. I mean, they're like superhuman strength. And outside of that state, nicest guys in the world to do anything in the world for you. But that's not who you're dealing with when they get in a psychotic episode. So I get that that's not Bryn. From a clinical standpoint, I totally get that. Trust me, I get it. And your position is you didn't ask to get in that state, right? No. You didn't say, hey, let's get psychotic and see what happens.
No.
And some people do that, by the way. I grew up in the LSD era where people said, let's go on an LSD trip and see what
happened.
Really, I had friends that did it on purpose and said, let's take a trip and see what happened. I never was trusted myself enough to do that. Mm-hmm. But you were put in that state involuntarily. And that's a completely different scenario. But there are others that get in that state involuntarily. Postpartum psychosis is involuntary, but a lot of those women get decades-long prison sentences. Mm. And that's a biochemical phenomenon they didn't ask for, but they wind up with decades-long prison sentences. Do you think about that? They're in the same situation you were in terms of an involuntary psychotic state.
Yes, of course I think about that. And I think that's what's complicated and frustrating about the justice system. It's like, what's the right thing to do for each client? And I don't know their stories, so I can't really say, do they deserve to be in prison or not? But people think I deserve to be in prison. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry.
Do you ever worry that this will happen again?
No. I'm not worried. I will never, ever ingest marijuana in any way ever again.
You're done. No more.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't think they could hold you down under any circumstance. I'd like to add your team to this conversation. Joining us now is Bryn's legal team, attorneys Bob Swartz, Michael Goldstein, and I'm going to just ask you to help me with your name so I don't butcher it.
Agop Kuyumjan.
Okay, I'll take you at your word. Also here is Dr. Dan Buffington, one of the 4 experts who found that Bryn was in a cannabis-induced psychosis at the time of the incident. And for those of you that watch, you know that I've done more than one show on the dangers of marijuana, and premier among them, the fact that it can trigger a psychotic episode. There are risk factors that make that more likely for some people than others, but it's a very real risk for anyone that takes marijuana, particularly the potency that we see today. Here's a quick explanation of why that is from Dr. Buffington.
When someone ingests THC, that's the primary psychoactive chemical in marijuana. It attaches to the CB1 receptors. Normally, it may produce euphoria or a sense of relaxation. With higher potency marijuana products, they actually produce a greater level of change in dopamine and glutamate, 2 very important neurotransmitters or chemicals that the brain uses for normal balance. And you're creating an exaggerated psychiatric response, which could be as basic as anxiety and fear, or go out as far as hallucinations and psychoses. One of the greatest risk factors for cannabis-induced psychosis is in a person who doesn't use marijuana. They have the most exaggerated response to high-potency THC. So here lie the biggest factors. One is the high potency carries with it a much greater risk. So too does the way it's prepared. You're basically giving someone too much at one time. And if they're naive, then that effect of dopamine and glutamate release, that's a perfect storm for creating a cannabis-induced psychosis.
I made the comment when we were talking that this is not your grandma's marijuana. When in the 60s and 70s, marijuana would be 4 or 5%. And now you can get products where THC is as high as 80, 90%. And it's just a very different impact, particularly if someone takes it that hasn't built up a resistance or accommodation to it. Dr. Buffington, let me start with you. What did Chad's autopsy reveal in terms of toxicology and what was actually involved on this particular night?
Right. So in Chad's autopsy, it actually demonstrated THC, so tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the parent or the primary psychoactive agent in the marijuana plant. And his level was about 48 nanograms per mil, which is substantial.
Yeah, that is substantial. Mm-hmm. And if you're a naive user and you're just not accustomed to that potency in marijuana, it can have a profound effect on you. Is that fair to say?
Extreme. And I guess one analogy is when we look at alcohol, you can think of how maybe a beer or wine might have 4 or 5, up to 15% maybe percent alcohol in it. And yet when you look at grain alcohol, that's up to 100%. Right. So the same thing is the potency. So people just think it's the plant, but a lot of agricultural development and technology, literally at the level of the pharmaceutical industry level, research and development, has cultivated strains that are just in the same weight of the substance that you're going to burn in the bong, is producing magnitudes higher of delivery of THC.
Right. And if you're expecting one and you get something way down the continuum, I've likened it before to expecting a beer and getting roofied, where you get a drug that completely changes your capacity for self-determination. And if that was in his toxicology report, we were dealing with some very potent substance that night.
You would be. It also would have been evidence of the accumulation. So if he is accustomed to smoking more edibles, more other types of products, that amount would be indicative that he is ingesting and taking in more. So it's a little unfair to think, too, that if he's got 48, why didn't he have the same reaction? And I think you referred to that receptor tolerance, where someone is able to be exposed to more.
Yeah. There's a phenomenon referred to as stacking. When Bryn put her lips to the bong twice, there's no way to say how many doses actually were stacked at that point. We don't know what she may have inhaled, ingested.
You're absolutely right. And if you kind of look at the granular facts, one of the things she recalled was, in addition to him stating that it would be more intense, and let's try this to see if you feel a different effect, that recollection that he went back and put something else in, the time it took, there's ways to prepare a bong, and you just used the term stacking. Another term is milking, and that's because of the way it appears in that glass chamber. They call it ripping. So burning one bowl into that chamber is going to have a cloudy appearance.
Right.
A second, a third, a fourth, a fifth is going to eventually make a white or opaque appearance. And that's what she recalled, was that when he gave it back, and that sense of urgency, is that was a different appearance and different time to prepare than what the first dose.
There are a number of reasons why I came to the conclusion that Bryn was experiencing a cannabis-induced psychosis. The first is that Bryn was not an experienced user. The other is that THC was the only substance identified in her system, and it was at a level of 13, which is capable of producing psychoactive effects. The next important factor is the delivery method. The person who prepared this for brought multiple doses into the same chamber, into a 3-foot bong. So it's like the equivalent of taking multiple doses of a medication at the same time.
Dr. Buffington took the stand as an expert witness in Bryn's trial. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury found Bryn guilty of involuntary manslaughter in Chad O'Melia's killing. But that wasn't the end of it for Bryn. She still had to be sentenced. The judge in her case initially sentenced Bryn to 2 years probation. Her sentence was later changed, and she was given 3 years probation, a no-contact order with the victim's family, and ordered to attend a 52-week domestic violence program. I'm guessing that from the attorney point of view here, that you guys were pleased with the sentence, but I'm guessing that you probably respectfully disagree with the jury finding.
Without a doubt. We, from the beginning of this case, from the first time we met Bryn, we believed in Bryn's innocence, emphatically. And I think Bryn would tell you the same thing. In terms of the verdict, I think, and I'll speak for myself on this, it's my opinion that the jury just couldn't wrap their head around the science, the specific issues. And I think the judge saw it differently. Judge Worley learned a lot about this case through the testimony of our 4 experts, through Bryn, through Mr. O'Melia's roommates. about his chronic marijuana habits. And he also knew that Bryn was a naive user. She had used marijuana, less than 10 times. And through that, he saw the type of person Bryn was. He saw the type of character she possesses. And even though the jury may not have been able to wrap their heads around the science and the issues, the judge got it right. The judge got it right.
So let me jump in on that point.
Please.
Just so you know, Dr. Phil, the case started out as a murder. The defense experts, as well as the expert who was retained by the prosecution, all came to the conclusion that Bryn's actions were the result of a cannabis-induced psychotic state. For those reasons, the prosecution reduced the charge to involuntary manslaughter before trial. So we went to trial on the charge of involuntary manslaughter, which is essentially criminal negligence. Our defense at the trial was what's known as involuntary intoxication. And we had two separate but related grounds for the involuntary intoxication. One was that Bryn inhaled the marijuana under duress, that Chad had pressured her into smoking from the bong. The second ground was that there was some trickery or fraud involved. And that centered on one fact, which is that Chad knew what was in the bong, Bryn did not, and significantly, Chad had a roommate who had smoked out of that same bong previously. That roommate had an extreme, if not psychotic, reaction. That reaction, including his own testimony in the case, that he thought he was going to die, that he was seeing contorted images, including contorted faces, and that he felt like he needed to take his clothes off and run outside. Now, that's the roommate who had inhaled from exactly the same bong. Chad did not tell Bryn about that experience. I asked Bryn on the witness stand if she knew about that previous experience of the roommate, whether she would have inhaled any marijuana that night. And her answer was, not only would I not, but I would never use marijuana again the rest of my life if I knew about it. Now, fast forward to your question that you asked Michael. So we spoke with 9 of the 12 jurors afterward, and I got the impression that the jurors just didn't want to let Bryn off because she had stabbed Chad so many times. We had this discussion in the jury room with 9 of these jurors, and one of the points that they made, which I think reinforces what I'm saying, is that Bryn, when she noticed this milky substance in the bong, should have been on notice. That's what they told us. The problem with that reasoning from the jury was that on notice of what? On notice that she was going to get high, or on notice that she was going to have a psychotic break and stab Chad multiple times, stab her own dog, and then stab herself numerous times and almost kill herself. So when we heard that, it left me with the impression that that couldn't have been the real reason. So do I think that the jury got it wrong? Yes, I do. I mean, I respect the jury system. I've done many, many jury trials. On this one, I think they got it wrong.
I've not seen the jury charge, but in the instruction, did they put a condition to the jury that in order for this to be involuntary manslaughter, that she had to be unconscious at the time?
No. The way that...
that was not in the jury charge?
No, but it was, let me just add, it was agreed upon all the experts that she was essentially in an unconscious state. That all the experts agreed that she had no cognitive or conscious awareness of what she was doing at the time of the killing. So the jury instruction, Dr. Phil, provided that involuntary manslaughter can consist of intoxicating yourself with a substance under duress or under trickery, I think the trickery or I think misrepresentation. I forget the exact word, but in any event, the concept was the same. So it was undisputed. I think the prosecution it had to acknowledge that she was literally out of her mind at the time that this was happening.
And so that fulfilled the unconscious
Yes.
requirement
That's right.
for involuntary manslaughter, even though she remembered the stabbing, getting the knives, stabbing the dog, scattering the chairs, all things that would constitute conscious awareness.
Right. The great question, but when she was having these after-the-fact memories, she was having delusions and hallucinations. So she was having, after the fact, she was having memories, but this was not a real experience. I mean, this is sort of the definition of a psychotic state. You lose the ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination and delusion. And she couldn't make that separation at the time she was in this state.
Yeah, and I think that's real hard. Having testified as an expert on a number of times, I think that's real hard for the jury. Unless you've been in that state before, it's real hard for the jury to differentiate between cognitive awareness and a hallucination that can seem real, but is an out-of-body experience, or it's something that you don't ground in reality. You can't distinguish between fantasy and reality.
True. One other thing to throw in the mix here is that, as you learn from Bryn, deputies arrived at the scene. One of them was wearing what's known as body-worn video. The video footage revealed Bryn's conduct. So we saw in real time what was happening with Bryn, and it was shocking. We saw, and the jury saw this, Bryn emitting blood-curdling screams. We saw and heard the deputies telling her to drop the knife as she's stabbing herself repeatedly. Then we saw on the video footage, and I know this is hard to revisit, we saw on the video footage Bryn being tased 4 times. She still was stabbing herself. And then, as you alluded to, one of the deputies struck her with a metal tip baton 9 times, and it took until the 9th time to dislodge the knife from her hand, and that probably saved her life. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't be here today.
I've dealt with those as small as you in an agitated psychotic episode before, and they truly have superhuman strength. It's hard to imagine if you haven't actually dealt with it, and that is hard for a jury to wrap their head around. If you haven't been there, I mean, it sounds like a story you've made up. Were you there for the jury debrief?
Yes, I was there, and ultimately, a lot of people, I think, just can't wrap their heads around the fact that marijuana is powerful enough to cause this kind of an effect on someone and cause this kind of reaction. And I think that is something that is very dangerous, because a lot of people smoke marijuana with the understanding or the expectation that it's going to be one kind of reaction, like they're going to get high and they're going to want maybe a bag of Doritos or something like that. And it has, because like what you were saying, Dr. Phil, you may be getting a potent strain that you just didn't expect that you were getting.
And I think it's paradoxical, because people are right. If you smoke marijuana, it does tend to kind of put you in a Spicoli type mellow sort of state most of the time, and is not associated with violence until you have an ab reaction and it triggers something else. And then it's not the marijuana, it's what it triggers. And then you're in a whole different ballgame. I mean, when it triggers the psychotic break, you're psychotic. It doesn't matter how you got there. You're psychotic. And if marijuana generally creates a mellow state, okay, most people would say that's been their experience. Most people don't have a psychotic episode unless they're predisposed genetically to it. It's in their bloodline, or they have some other comorbidity when they take it. But then there's that small fraction of a percentage that still has the reaction, even if they don't have, the predisposing conditions. And that can happen when you have a really potent strain of the substance, right?
Absolutely. And I think the word you used, paradoxical, is exactly what we use clinically, is we understand, not to get too technical on it, but that the endocannabinoid system, which primarily involves the CB1 and CB2 receptors, is absolutely affects and produces those physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. And up to a certain level or concentration and potency, the reaction is, like you said, something that people are accustomed to. It's stereotypical. Above that, and certainly now with high potency products, the research and development has grown so exponentially that there's now hundreds of thousands of emergency room cases being reported. So if people say, I've never heard it, it's happening. Does every case end up with this exact same scenario? No, but you end up with a hyper-excited state and release of dopamine and glutamine.
We also had an interesting issue in our case because, of course, with technology and the modernization of technology, we were able to get all the cell phone records from the cell phones of Bryn and Chad. And the cell phone records of Chad highlighted in text messages that were undisputed, and they were introduced at the time of trial, that Chad was ordering through an illicit delivery service, and he was specifically ordering marijuana at a strength of 31.8%. I mean, and this was in the text messages, and these were introduced by us, of course, not the district attorney. Mm-hmm. But, and
let me jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Point. And we presented evidence from the website of the marijuana delivery service that there was a warning for this particular strain that he was purchasing. And the warning said, caution for high tolerance users only.
And it was the only strand on that website.
Yeah.
And this was evidence that was within the possession of the district attorney for the last 5 years. And that warning only applied to the specific strand that Mr. O'Melia was purchasing by name and by THC potency at the 31.8. So when you look at it, he controlled the environment. It was his bong. It was his marijuana. It was his house. He was loading it. He was handing it to Ms. Spejcher. He was ordering the strongest marijuana on that website. And he had the hindsight, unlike Ms. Spejcher, of having the situation where his roommate, just 2 months before that, smoked out of that same bong and had a very similar effect and thought he was going to die. Had Bryn known about those facts, it's highly unlikely she would have taken a hit that night, let alone two. But Mr. O'Melia knew about the prior reaction of his roommate, and he knew that there was a warning on this marijuana that it should only be used by high tolerance users only, and he knew that Ms. Spejcher was a naive user. And that's what people don't understand.
Yeah.
And the cautionary tale of this case, and I told this to the jury in my closing argument, is that if this could happen to Bryn, this could happen to anybody.
Well, I've had an emergency room doctor on from a major city emergency room that we were talking about the insanity of legalizing marijuana. And she said, hear everybody saying, oh, it's okay, it's just like alcohol. She said, I'm telling you, that is a higher form of insanity. You should not do this. You can't do it. I have them showing up here all hours of the night having bad reactions to this because the agricultural science has jacked this up so high, and the dispensaries will sell it, anything to anybody that asks for it. They say we don't. We say this is for beginners. That's not true. You can walk in and buy whatever you got the money for.
Exactly. And remember, in this case, you had 4 expert witnesses, none of which knew each other. They had never spoken with each other. Some were from different states, such as Dr. Buffington, coming into a case and concluding there was an absolute consensus among 4 experts that didn't know each other that it was cannabis-induced psychosis, and quickly. And as soon as Dr. Wershing, which was one of our experts, reached that conclusion, as well as Dr. Fong, Timothy Fong from UCLA, who runs their cannabis program. He's a psychiatrist. The district attorney had Ms. Spejcher tested by their go-to expert, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Chris Mohandi, who immediately concluded that he agreed with the opinions of Dr. Wershing and Dr. Fong, and ultimately Dr. Buffington. So you had, again, 4 doctors that didn't know each other. So this wasn't some type of con job defense. And
yeah. I'm sure that his family is frustrated by it and feels like he did not get justice. And I hate that for them. I hate the outcome of this. And you have to look at Bryn's history leading up to this. That's why I asked the questions I did about your career and how much time and dedication and hard work it takes to get the certifications that you have, the doctorate that you have, the work that you do, how much discipline and and how much that gives back to those that have that affliction. And it just, this, you have to take all that into account. I certainly hope you're allowed to get back into that very soon. What a terrible waste if they don't respond to that.
Thank you, Dr.
To do that. And I thank you guys for coming here and talking about this. You can look at this and say, well, there's another woke DA and another woke judge and all that's just letting violent criminals walk out the door. And that would be a terrible mischaracterization of.
Yes, those perceptions, we're hearing from a lot of people, and it's all over the social media, et cetera, and it's wrong.
This was a straight-up trial, and I'm just glad you're here and not somewhere else right now. And I'm sorry that this happened to you, and I'm sorry that you had to go through this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I'm sorry for Chad and his family as well. I think
we all are.
Nobody wanted this to happen. I do hope this is a cautionary tale. People need to pay attention to this. This isn't just some theoretical possibility that this can happen, and this isn't an isolated case. Sadly, it happens more often than people realize.
Yeah.
But I commend your courage for coming here and talking about this and telling your side of the story and putting a face on this. And I think you deserve to get your life back and get moving forward. If there's anything I want you to learn from listening to Bryn's story, it's that marijuana is a serious and dangerous drug that should not be taken lightly. So many people nowadays claim marijuana isn't even a drug at all, claiming it's just weed. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not just weed. What happened in Bryn's case is a tragedy, and our hearts and prayers go out to the family of the victim and all those impacted by this horrific loss of life. Just because you think a little hit of marijuana won't do much, boy, how wrong could that be? Be careful. Think twice the next time someone offers you something they say isn't a drug. I'll see you next time.